Give us a little bit of the history of hydroponics so we can appreciate your innovations and how you're part of this generation of see it and solve it innovators.
Yeah, so hydroponics really, back in ancient Egypt, it would be described actually today as aquaponics. So essentially a method of growing in the water where you get your nutrients from fish, essentially fish excrement. And now in the 1900s, we had really the United States military had these island bases where there was no opportunity for traditional agriculture, but they needed to produce food. And so one of the things that had been researched recently was the opportunities around hydroponics. And so in the 1940s, on some of these Pacific islands, they built metal troughs, which they grew in on the island and produced an impressive amount of food. Unfortunately, because the technology was so new, plastics had really not been created yet around this technology. It was just not feasible unless you're on a remote Pacific island. And so the technology really died away for a couple decades. It saw a resurgence in the 80s, but it was still really cost prohibitive to do normal agricultural production. But that's when you saw things like Epcot come into play, where you can go down to Disney and see all of these hydroponics. Like that's the 80s. So you saw this resurgence in the 80s. But in general, it was really just a cool science project. Most of the initiatives where people tried to convert greenhouses in space into hydroponics really did not succeed across the board. Now you have, through that time period into the 90s and early 2000s, you see countries like the Netherlands, which has very limited land use, begin to really invest in greenhouse technology and hydroponic technology. And today they're the second largest producer of vegetables in the world. And a lot of that vegetable comes from hydroponic production. And so they went high tech and they invested in basically controlling every aspect. So the idea behind hydroponics is really simple. It's that you take all the nutrients that you would normally get from the soil. Basically, the plants usually have to break soil down into those basic building blocks like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And in hydroponics, you just apply that directly. And so it's kind of like hooking an IV up to a plant. So you dissolve those nutrients into the water, and then the plant's roots sit in that water, and it has a perfect access to those nutrients and water and everything it needs. So what that does is it allows you to focus all of the energy of the plant on upward growth rather than downward growth. And that creates, 25% faster and more production out of a plant. But what's really cool is you build these enclosed systems. So water is not evaporating and it's not running off. And so you can save upwards of 90%, if not more, depending on the system you use in hydroponics. It also saves about 3/4 of the space. And so in some of these plants, you can take an acre and put it under glass in a greenhouse, and you can get 14 times the amount of tomatoes in the same amount of space that you'd ever be able to achieve in traditional farming practices. So that's what we really saw people investing in, is this commercial style. You get a massive facility, you control every aspect of production. It's really expensive to build and it's really expensive to run, and there's a lot of risk. If things go wrong, they go wrong kind of catastrophically. There's a real cascading effect in these systems. And so the type of hydroponics that I learned is way less well known. It's almost a hobbyist style of hydroponics. It's basically called simplified hydroponics. And the idea is you really strip that complexity down to the barest essentials. You're really only controlling for the water and the fertilizer levels. And so you lose some of that efficiency that you see in the commercial high-tech vertical growing systems. But what we do is so easy and so simple that it can be made out of simple things like PVC pipe, right? Or even as simple as a 5-gallon pail that you've just drilled a couple holes into. But you still retain a lot of that water saving, that space saving, and it's so easy to teach people. So that's the hydroponics that I was initially introduced to in 2016, and really we began to work and innovate around.